Hello and welcome to my presentation on how to raise a successful highline layer. So my name is Dr. Seiche Gengers. I am the Technical Services Manager for Southeast Asia for Highline International. And today we're going to talk a little bit about pullet management and good brooding practices so that you can raise the best possible bird to give you the kind of production that you want at home on your farms. So what this talk is really about is how to start a good pullet. And what's really critical is we're going to talk a little bit first about the background, about what makes a good pullet, and then we're going to talk about feed, light, air, water, sanitation, and temperature. And then later you'll have a discussion on disease from the veterinary experts in Korea. So ultimately, the reason we want to have a good pullet is because we have these production goals for our egg-laying farms. We want to have a really nice production. We want to have good peak that's going to require good livability. We want good feed conversion so we can get more eggs for less input. We want to have a bird that is very easy to manage. And lastly, we really want to avoid chronic stressors and diseases that are going to decrease our production overall. The key to doing all of this is to have really good pullet development. By setting the bird up well in the beginning, you're going to be successful later on. And the reality is, the full range of genetic potential can only be seen when we have the right foundation. The right foundation is going to be comprised of the genetics of the bird, the health of the bird, the management of the bird, and the nutrition. And all of that is going to come together to give you the best possible egg production. It's important to remember that literally everything that we do affects the balance of the energy in the bird. Genetics is what's going to unlock the potential for the egg production, but energy allocation is going to be what really makes it happen. And at the end of the day, everything that we do is going to be management. How we manage this energy is going to be what unlocks the genetic potential of the birds that you place on your farms. So how is energy used by the bird? Well, this is a general idea of how energy is utilized. The first thing that you have are resources, and that's right here in the middle. These resources can be considered the inputs you have from the feed, things that the bird is going to bring energy in with. The bird's then going to use these resources, and it's first going to drive those resources towards maintenance here at the top, and then it's going to use those same resources for physical activity, for viral defenses, bacterial defenses, and then lastly, growth in eggs. So in a healthy bird, the biggest arrow should be going towards growth or eggs so that we get the best production out of her. But what happens when this energy balance is off? So what happens when they get sick, let's say? Maybe they get infectious bronchitis virus. Well, what happens is we have to start shunting resources away from somewhere and putting them somewhere else. So in this case, we have a viral disease. And so the growth in eggs arrow has been reduced, and instead, this arrow here going towards viral defense, and I'll highlight this in red, has gotten bigger. I'm highlighting it in red because we've pulled energy away now, and this is, for us as a producer, a negative energy because now the bird has to use the feed resources that you've given them to fight a viral disease instead of putting that towards either growing bigger as a pullet or producing eggs when she's older. Now this is just the beginning of disease. What happens if the disease progresses and gets worse? Well, we have to start pulling even more energy in this direction towards viral defense. And growth in eggs gets very, very restricted. So some birds are still going to lay eggs. You can see there's still some energy allocation here. But ultimately, the majority of energy now is going towards viral defense. And you can see physical activity has come down a little bit, and maintenance is also reduced a little bit. What happens when the disease still gets worse? Well, as we know, they might clear the infectious bronchitis virus, but what comes in next is almost always a bacterial infection with E. coli. And so what happens then is they've used up most of their viral defense, they've fought off the infectious bronchitis virus. And you can see it's very small, but now there's secondary attack. And the secondary attack is going towards bacterial defenses. But if we remember, the bird already decreased physical activity and maintenance. Well, if you decrease your general maintenance, staying alive, and you decrease your physical activity, you can't eat as much resource. So this whole pool is smaller. So now we have a sick bird that does not feel good, that has to spend all of its energy fighting bacterial defense. There's no growth in eggs, right? Nothing's going on over here. And she's barely eating or drinking, which means she's probably just going to start to get worse unless we can get her back consuming resources and energy. So it gets even smaller if she gets overloaded. Now she can barely handle the system. She's taking in nothing, no physical activity. There's no growth, no eggs. There's just enough maintenance to try and stay alive. And there's the last bit of reserves that she has to try and defend from bacteria and viruses coming in. Her system is overloaded. She can't handle the stressor that's been put on it in the form of disease. So the very last step is dead, right? There's no energy left for maintenance. There's nothing more coming in. And when you stop maintenance, you can't support your immune system, so there's no bacterial and no viral defense. And the first thing we lost was growth in eggs. So this is just so that you can understand everything that we do is going to change where this bird is going to put her energy. And our goal as managers, as people who raise pullets or raise a good pullet that we want to purchase, is going to be to have a bird that was able to put all of her energy towards growth in eggs. And the best way of doing that is to ensure that she has little to no stressors and to manage the stressors we have to have appropriately. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we do that now from start to finish. So the first thing that's happening in the bird's life is physiological development. So from the time that day-old chick arrives until she goes into the production facility, she has to grow from a very, very small 36-gram chick or maybe 30-gram chick all the way up into a big 1.3, 1.4, or maybe even bigger kilogram bird to lay eggs. And to do that, she has to develop all of these systems. So the first 5 weeks are going to develop this. When we talk about the energy required, it's the energy to grow organs, like the digestive system. So she has to grow all of her intestines. She has to work on growing and creating her circulatory system. So that's her arteries, veins, the blood flow that's going to take nutrients and get rid of garbage all over the body. She also has to develop her immune system. The bursa is working very hard to create more B cells to go out and protect the bird against bacterial infections or viral infections. She has to promote and grow her renal system. That's the kidneys, so that she can appropriately rehydrate herself if she gets dehydrated and take care of waste that needs to leave via the urine. She has to make sure her regulatory systems like respiratory and thermoregulation are also fully on board. So when a baby chick arrives, she's not able to keep herself warm or cool yet, and she has to develop that thermoregulation system. So that brings us to how do we manage these things successfully? I've told you we have to grow all these systems and we have to manage how energy comes in and out of the bird, disease, and everything else. But what does that mean to me on my farm? Well, that's when I come into an acronym that I call FLAWS TD. And FLAWS TD stands for feed, light, air, water, sanitation, temperature, and disease. So why do I bring this up? Well, these are the things that I look at when I go to a farm. And I want to go through in my mind, what do these birds need for a happy, non-stressful life? Well, they need feed, light, air, water, good sanitation, good temperature, and they want to be disease-free for the most part. So that's how I evaluate each visit I have to my farm in a day. And that's something that can help you on your farms really consider, okay, where are my problem areas? Is everything optimal? And if not, how do I fix it? So the first week before the birds arrive, so 7 days before your new day-old chicks come to the farm, there are some things we can do to prepare to make sure that FLAWS TD is really up to date and ready to go and make sure those birds have the best start. So 14 days before they come, make sure all the old feed is out of the house. You certainly don't want to eat something that's maybe been old or moldy and left out outside in the air. Maybe it's gotten stale, and it could also have a lot of bacteria in it or other contaminants. So make sure you take out all the old feed and that those feed troughs are nice and clean. Next, we want to make sure the whole house has been cleaned and disinfected. Older birds carry a lot more diseases than young birds do because older birds are better able to defend against it. So you would never see any problems from that disease, but they still carry that bacteria or a respiratory virus a lot of the times, and they can pass it to young chicks, and this can be very lethal or cause a slow, delayed stunting effect on those pullets. So we want to make sure our house has been cleaned and disinfected so that the new baby birds have a nice environment to come home to. You also want to make sure 14 days before you get birds that you have good rodent control. It's a great time to put out extra bait. Just make sure you can take out rats, mice, things of this nature that can potentially eat your day-old chicks, or they can bring in a lot of different diseases. And at 14 days when there are no birds in the house, it's a really great time to make repairs to any broken equipment, maybe cages, feed lines, egg belts. It's a really nice time to just make sure everything is working smoothly. There's no birds in the house, so any maintenance and equipment work you need to do won't stress the birds out. 2 days before birds arrive, it's a really good idea to potentially start brooders or heaters in the house to pre-warm the house. This has shown great improvement in broilers and other species in terms of brooding livability in the first week or two. So pre-warming the house can actually have a tremendous effect on the quality your birds feel when they arrive. The next thing you want to do is potentially place paper in cages, and we'll talk about some different options for that. And then you want to make sure the water system is really clean. So why clean the water system 2 days before and not 14 days before? The reason is because water gets reinfected very quickly. Bacteria loves warm, dark, wet environments. And water lines are dark because they're very enclosed. They're definitely wet because they're full of water or they're left damp or partially empty. And they're nice and warm because they're inside the poultry house where you have lovely heaters and other insulation going on that they wouldn't have in another environment. And so they can get reinfected very quickly, and it's better to just sanitize them just before birds come and then flush them out so they're free and clean. And then when birds arrive, they should have enough water flow that they help keep those lines clean with whatever maintenance sanitation system you're using. So the day before the birds arrive, you want to make sure you have the correct house temperature and humidity. You also want to make sure you set your lights to an intermittent schedule, and we can talk about intermittent lighting programs later. Fill and adjust all your feeders. You want everything to be at the right height and easy to find. We want to adjust our drinkers, and then lastly, we want to go ahead and flush water lines. When the chicks arrive, make sure you fill your cup drinkers if you have them, or potentially allow for a hanging drop on any nipple drinkers you have. And I'll talk a little more about that later. You can add vitamins and electrolytes to the water. And lastly, if you're using it, you can place starter feed on paper to attract them to the front of the troughs and get them to find feed very quickly. So, temperature. Baby birds are what we call poikilotherms, which means they have to have our help. They cannot stay warm on their own. This is really important. It's very critical to movement. And the reason it's critical to movement is because if these little birds are cold, they're not going to go anywhere. They don't want to get up and walk away from their friends they're huddling with because it's too cold. And so if they're cold, I'm not going to go eat and I'm not going to go drink. And if I don't eat and I don't drink, then I die. So that's really not optimal because, as we know, dead chickens don't lay eggs. So the next thing that can cause a lot of problems if their temperature isn't well regulated is what I like to talk about as temperature swings. When I have big changes in temperature from daytime to nighttime, it can get too hot and then too cold, and that's very stressful to the bird, constantly trying to readjust to both temperatures. This can cause really pasty vents that we'll see a photo of later, and it'll down-regulate the immune system, which lets in bacteria. So then all of our energy, again, is going to go to trying to regulate our maintenance system, and not enough is going to go into getting food or sleep. And then lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about humidity and the importance of humidity, because humidity affects the temperature that the body feels. And my best description of this is if any of you have ever been in bed and taken the blanket and put it up over your head, and it feels very stuffy almost, like you can't breathe as much. And that's that buildup of the humidity, making that temperature in the covers feel a lot hotter. And so humidity can certainly increase the temperature your birds feel. And even though your thermometer may read the right temperature, the actual thing that they feel is too much, it's too hot, and you're actually putting stress on the birds. So humidity is something we need to be aware of. The other side to humidity is it's possible for humidity to be too low. And if it's too dry, you can actually have some sinus problems in the bird. That's an effect of that, and too dusty in the house, which brings in more bacteria to the respiratory system. So humidity is an important part of what we want to regulate. So what does the Highline brown chick like? Well, the brown chicks like it pretty warm. They want it to be 35 to 36 degrees in the house when they arrive. And ideally, I like to think of 40 to 60% humidity as being the right spot to be. You can go up to 65. This is no problem and a very reasonable set point. When I start to get concerned is when I'm walking into houses that the lowest that they can control the humidity to is 70%, 80%. These things happen, especially in open-sided houses, in environments that are very humid. And this is always a goal or a target. If I can control my humidity to the level of 60%, that's wonderful. However, in some of our cultures and climates in Southeast Asia and in Northern Asia and in Korea, the humidity is just too high outside, and there's no way we can get our humidities down enough. So I think it's just a very good idea to shoot for 40 to 60% when it's possible. The next thing you want to do is actually reduce the temperatures on the birds for 2 to 3 degrees Celsius per week until you get down to about 21 or 22 degrees. The goal of that is as the birds get older, they're much better at thermoregulating. They shed these light, fluffy down feathers, and then they grow their adult feathers in. And as they're doing that process, they're much easier and better able to regulate their body temperature and stay warm on their own. They become capable of regulating. Ultimately, the guide on temperature is make sure they're comfortable. The birds that arrive at your farm may not be comfortable at 35 degrees, so you might have to increase the temperature if they look too cold. The birds at your farm might be too hot at 35 degrees, and you might need to decrease the temperature a little bit. At the end of the day, the birds will always tell you what they need, and this is a really nice guideline. Because if you live in a very hot and humid environment, that humidity is going to make the temperature felt by the chicks much higher, and you're going to need to shoot for different temperatures. So always, always, always let the birds tell you what they need. So how do we know they're comfortable? Seiche, you said the birds, they're going to tell me what they need, but how are they going to tell me? Well, all you have to do is go and look. So what do birds look like when they're too hot or too cold? This is an example with a brooder stove, but the same concept applies to birds in cages that are heated by space heaters or radiant overhead heaters. It's the same idea, but I like this example because it's simple to see. So each of these little yellow dots in the circles are going to be the chicks, and the center of each circle is the brooder stove. So this one is perfect. This is normal here in the corner. And so we know it's normal because the birds are evenly spread throughout the whole brooder ring. So this is the brooder ring here on the outside, and the birds are nicely spread all the way through. And there's no chicks in the center where it's very, very hot. When they're too cold, all of the birds are concentrated up here under the brooder stove. And so the birds huddle together and they stay in one spot. When they're too hot, they move as far away from the center as they can get because it's too hot in the center and they crowd the walls. So temperature should be brought down. In this case, what you have usually is a draft in this last case. So the wind or something comes in here and the birds move away in order to get warm. So they move in this direction to get to the warm side of the brooder ring. The same things will be true in your cages. If the birds are huddled to the side or to the back or on paper or on a feeder tray, it's oftentimes because they're too cold. If they're really spread out and pushed against all the walls of the cage, they could be too hot. So how do we manage those cages in radiant heat? Because in the house, what we're doing is we're really relying on consistent house temperature and ventilation. There's not a brooder stove where the birds can kind of move towards it and move away from it to get warmer. And this is a difficulty we have when we talk about whole house brooding or radiant heat management, because the birds don't always know where to go to get warm when they can, or where to go to get cooler when they can. So because of that, there's a couple different variations in the way that we set up the floor of the cages that can become really critical for the success of temperature regulation in our young birds. So the first one is what I like to think of as a wire mesh base. So you can see the floor here of these birds, and I'll do this in orange, is just this wire down here at the bottom. And it's a mesh with rings. You can kind of see the same thing up here. Same thing, this wire mesh. It is a good size for birds in that their feet aren't going to slip through the bottom of it and they're not going to get stuck. So the chicks can comfortably walk on this. However, there's a few pros to it and a few cons. The pros to this kind of a setup are that you get very, very good manure control from the beginning. And there's little to no labor associated with needing to put paper in or take paper out or putting cardboard, those sorts of things. So the cons to this, though, is that there's no insulation provided to the birds. So if there's a draft in this house, if these chicks get too cold, they have not so many places that they can go to get warm where a breeze isn't going to blow up through these holes. If you think about it, this is open space down here. So air can flow up and through like this. Same down here. It can go up and through the birds, cooling them down and potentially making them too cold. The other side of that is you're also going to need extra equipment for supplemental drinking and feeding if that's something you want to do. So these birds do have that in these cages. You can see that here, and I'll highlight it in red. So this is the supplemental feeder. These birds have both a supplemental drinker and a supplemental feed pan here that makes easy feed access for them. But that is extra equipment and extra work in order to have the birds find feed and water faster. The next option, which is very common in Korea, is to have paper with holes in it. So this is still an additional paper you put into the cage that covers up the wires, lets the birds stay on top of the wire so they're not slipping through or falling. And allows a little bit more bird comfort and temperature control than just the wire mesh alone. So the benefits of paper with holes is having a moderate draft protection, but you still have to think there are a lot of holes in this paper, right? It's not like just a few holes. And so you still get a lot of airflow that's going to come up through those spaces, but it will be less than with the wire mesh cage floors. The other pro that you're going to have with this paper is you are going to have some moderate cycling of coccidia if you're using the vaccine. So if you're going to use the new coccidiosis vaccine in Korea, then what you can do is you can get more cycling on this kind of paper than using a wire mesh. And in fact, I would always recommend having paper or some sort of cardboard tray in the cage to allow for cocci-cycling if you're going to be utilizing the vaccine. The downsides to this kind of paper is that you are still going to need extra equipment for supplemental feed. I cannot just dump feed on top of this. It will go right down into my manure belt or my manure pit and I will have wasted food. And then the same thing, you're going to have some increased labor because you're going to have to put that paper in and take that paper out later. And you're going to have a little bit of increased mess in terms of fecal material on top of the paper. Again, that's a great thing if you're trying to go for cocci-cycling of a coccidiosis vaccine, but it's maybe not so great in terms of just having increased moisture and wetness on the floor of the cage. So a solid paper base is another common option I see around the world. And so you can see that here in these two cages, we have a nice newspaper base here, and then we have another newspaper base here with some open areas. So benefits of having a solid paper base: you get really nice draft protection. So no airflow is going to come up underneath and cool those birds from below. You're going to have really good supplemental feeding. You don't have to have a feeder tray out here because you can dump this extra food right on the front of the paper, and those birds will find it right away as they walk over it. You're also going to have a really nice cycling of coccidiosis if you're vaccinating on having solid paper, because it's going to catch the majority of that vaccine as it passes through the bird and allow them to pick it back up and eat it. The downside of using the full paper, it's definitely more labor. You need to go through and have paper in every single cage, and you need to pull it back out when it's done. This is also going to be the messiest of all the options, because if you think about it, all the manure from these baby birds is going to go onto the paper. It's a wonderful thing if we're talking about cocci-cycling, but it is a lot more mess than just having a wire mesh. So all things considered, my personal favorite is to use full paper, like this solid paper base, but I think you need to choose which one works the best for your operation. In my opinion, I like the ease of the paper for delivering supplemental feed and attracting birds to the front of the cage. I like that it's good for cocci-cycling, and I like that it protects them from the drafts. And those benefits outweigh the added difficulty of labor for me, and the added difficulty of potentially having supplemental feeders in that would be more to clean and more issues to have. All things equal though, as long as you provide a good area of draft protection in every cage. So going back previously to other slides, if you think about that supplemental feeder pan that was out, that they had a spot they could get away from the airflow on, then that's going to be fine. They just need to have an area where they have good draft protection in case something does happen in the house and a fan gets stuck on or timers are set too long and they're going to draft the birds. So having an area of protection is really important. So what do we not want? Well, we want the chicks to be comfortable. It's all about chick comfort at the end of the day. And what you can see here is birds that are too cold. Almost all the birds are on this draft protected area up here on this paper, but this paper doesn't cover the whole cage. And these wire mesh you see here, these are too big for those birds' feet. So these birds are actually getting stuck in these square wire mesh spaces, and they're also getting too cold. Furthermore, they have to leave the paper. There's a gap here in order to get to water. So they have to walk across the gap to get to water, and that's too cold for these birds. They're not going to want to do it. The house is already cold and drafty. They're huddled on the paper. They don't feel well, so they're having a very, very hard time getting to feed and water. So ultimately, you need to go look at the birds. Always, always, always inspect what you expect. What that means is just go look. If you think that there is paper covering all the cages appropriately and the birds should have no problem getting to feed and water, just make sure you walk in the house, check the different rows, and get a good idea that those birds are all eating and drinking appropriately. And then, of course, nothing is set in stone. Just because I have a favorite way of having cage paper in doesn't mean that your way isn't just as good or better for your farm. So always pick the option that suits you and your program best. So now the next thing we want to talk about, leaving a cage setup behind, is food and water. Now, my idea of food and water is essentially, if you build it, they will come. If you give them food and water, they are going to come and eat and drink. They are programmed to do that. So all you need to do is make it really easy to find, and your little baby birds are going to do the rest. So how do we know if they're eating? Well, we can do crop fill checks, and this is a really, really good thing to do at placement and up to 24 hours after placement. So when the chicks first arrive at placement, within 6 hours, you should have 75% of the chicks with feed in their crops. At 12 hours, 85% of all of the chicks should have feed, and at 24 hours, so a full day after arrival, you want to have 100% of the birds with food in their crop. And this is a nice picture you can see of what a bird looks like with feed in their crop versus not. So you can see here in his hand, this big outpouching just underneath the neck, nice and full of feed. And here, this bird has no feed in the crop. It's very, very flat. So how do we attract them to feed? The biggest thing you can do is go ahead and fill the feeders, the front of the feed trough, really high. A lot of places I visit don't actually put any feed in the feeders when the chicks start. And the downside to this is you're waiting longer to teach them where food is going to be for their whole life. So it's better to just fill them from the start so that they learn even faster where I should go to look for food every day. The next thing you want to do is if you're using any paper or a supplemental feeder, put that feed at the front of the cage because it's teaching them, hey, we walk to the front of the cage to find feed. If you only have food at the back of the cage, you're teaching them something a little bit opposite so that later in life when you go to run the feed troughs, they're going to take a little bit longer to find it up at the front of the cage because they're used to only seeing food at the back. In terms of drinkers, it's really important to understand how drinkers are designed. So I want to talk about cup drinkers first. The first thing you should do in the beginning is actually fill the cup drinkers manually for the first 3 days. And the reason for that is because the birds usually don't interact with them enough to keep that flow rate high. And so by filling them, the water reflects the light and they run into it and they see it more easily and they kind of remember where water is and to drink. They get attracted to it. So the first thing, make sure they're manually filled, totally full the first 3 days. And after that, you can let them fill like they normally would on their own. The next piece is making sure they're set at the correct level. A cup drinker is made to be drank out of by the bird dipping their head gently into the cup, which means they need to be at the height of the bird's back. So this way the bird can see over the drinker very easily, can dip its head in, get a full drink, and not have to struggle with that process. So drinkers too high, they're not going to take as much water because they're simply going to have a harder time finding it and reaching it. And when drinkers are too low, they're going to spend a lot of time stepping in it, running into it, and you can have a lot of issues with too much moisture in the house, right? It's going to raise your humidity. It's going to make your cage floors a mess. They're going to get water in their feed, and also water on the legs, on the down, wetting of the chicks is going to make them struggle to stay warm. If you're using a nipple drinker, you actually are having a design that is meant for the bird to drink at an angle pointing up. So you want the bird to actually extend the neck and come up to contact the nipple like this. And if you think about it, it makes sense. Because if I come up and poke the nipple like this with my mouth open, that water is going to run right down my neck and into my stomach. But if my nipple is here and I come into the side, most of the water is going to go down onto the floor and not into the bird's mouth. So with a nipple drinker, make sure your nipple height here is level with the bird's head, so they have to reach up to drink. The first thing you want to do when they arrive is to actually allow for a hanging drop. So the hanging drop is just a little droplet of water that sits right off the end of the nipple, off the end of the middle piece. And the reason is because that hanging drop is going to reflect the light, it's going to be sparkly, and the birds are going to think, oh, what's this? And they're going to learn to touch that nipple faster and learn that that's a water source, which is really important. The way that you do that is by decreasing your water pressure. Then that's going to allow some water to roll off and be down towards the end of the nipple, and you're going to create a hanging drop. I also really like this practice because you learn quickly. Hanging drop means low pressure. So when I walk into a pullet house when they're 15 weeks old and I see hanging drops, I know my water pressure is much too low. So it's a nice thing to catch in your mind as well. For later in life, you don't want hanging drops, you want good water pressure, but the first 3 days, I want low water pressure to let the birds have really easy access to water and to find it simply. The other important thing is on the very, very first day, you can keep the nipples down a little bit lower just so the birds kind of run into them and see where they're at, but they really do need to come up so that you don't have a mess on the floors and the birds are getting an adequate drink every time they drink. So what goes wrong? All these things should be pretty simple, but you'll find a lot of things run into trouble or get complicated in the house. So this is a really great example of what goes wrong in two situations. You can see we have a cage here and they have a nipple drinker line. So here's the nipple. Well, this bird's head is up over even the water line itself. And so to get a drink, it has to bend down and go underneath the water line just to get to it. And what I said earlier is with nipple drinkers, you need to have a nice angle up so that they go and hit the nipple and it runs down their neck. But you can see in this case, the birds are coming in from the top, they're hitting the nipple and all the water is going right down here into the catch and then usually overflowing that, and it becomes so messy. And now the bird's water source is very, very messy. It's been fouled with bacteria and manure from all of the other birds, so it's a huge hotspot for disease. Next, this whole space here they're in, that's a feeder tray. It is both empty, there's really no food in that, and it's very, very dirty. So these birds have been trained, this is where food is, but there's no food availability, just feces, and you're gonna have way more spreading of disease as they try to sort through this area to find feed. This is what it looks like when it's been set correctly. There's feed filling this feed trough up front. These birds can come up and drink it. And you can see here, the feeder and drinker line rather is much higher. The birds can see underneath it easily. This cup is in line with the backs of these birds. And so they have an easy time to come and drink water out of the cup. This is a pasty vent that I wanted to show you. This is a floor house, so it's a little bit different from cages, but the concept is the same. So you can see this area here on the chick, that's pasting, as I'm sure many of you have seen. And pasting is really a result of the temperature swings we talked about earlier. So this tells me the bird is under a tremendous amount of stress because it's getting too hot and too cold. So if you walk into your house and look through the cages, maybe you're checking crop fill, maybe you're just picking up birds or walking, and you see a lot of dark brown butts like this, you should go and check your temperature settings and the possible swings in the house, because that's going to result in a lot of stress that may show up later as disease, low chick weights, poor uniformity, those sorts of things. The next important area to look at is to really think about air. So we talked about air a little bit earlier, and I think we understand the general concepts behind ventilation and good fan time, but a lot of that's about temperature control. What we don't talk about as much is air quality. The reason that we really need to cycle the air through the house is actually less about temperature and more about making sure that bad gases are taken out, fresh oxygen is brought in, and you remove anything that's going to be an irritant to the bird. So the big one I like to think about is actually carbon dioxide. It's not that the birds aren't getting enough oxygen, it's that there's too much carbon dioxide in the house. And when you have a lot of carbon dioxide, the birds actually become very sleepy. And you can see that in these cages. There's a lot of birds over here at the back of the cage, and there's almost no birds eating. And at this age, there's plenty of food here. There should be all of these birds, or at least a third of these birds up at the front eating and drinking. And instead, they're all at the back. So that getting sleepy feeling from the high carbon dioxide is actually reducing our feed and water intake. That's going to increase our risk of dehydration. It's going to decrease our ability to gain weight, so we might be behind the standard. And then another odd thing that carbon dioxide will do is it's actually going to increase the risk of ascites or water belly in the bird. So when you have a cold bird, perhaps with a very, very liquidy chest, that comes from the fact that this high CO2 volume is actually telling the body that we don't have enough oxygen, even though they do. And that creates this pressure on the heart to pump more blood and to exchange more gas, and you end up with ascites. So that's a kind of end result of having a very high CO2 concentration for a long period of time. So the overall effects of poor ventilation, what are you going to see in pullets that had a struggle with ventilation early on? You're going to see delayed growth, a lot of stunting. You're going to have increased mortality and culling to things like ascites, maybe starvation or dehydration. It's also going to make them more susceptible to disease, which makes sense because if they're not eating and drinking, they're maybe not growing that immune system as much, and so they have a poor response. And then, of course, a lot of colibacillosis comes in as the only thing you're going to see because they don't have a great immune response. So why does this happen? Why do we really seem to struggle with CO2 buildup? Well, the reason, especially in cold climates, is because as I increase my runtime on my fans, it makes it more expensive for me to run the heater and maintain the temperature. Those things are always in constant battle with each other. Do I have more money to spend on heat, or do I run my fans more? And so we want to make sure that we find the right balance where the birds are still comfortable, but that we're still making a good profit on our farms. So always keep CO2 in the back of your mind, especially if you walk in and the birds just look sleepy all the time when they should be up eating and drinking. So now that we've talked about cage paper setups, we've talked about feed, we've talked about water. Let's talk about light on our FLAWS plan. So a really good idea to do is make sure that you have your lighting programs planned before the chicks are ever going to arrive. And it's important because we want to make sure we understand the impact of light on pullet growth and development. And we always want to make sure that we wait to light stimulate our birds later until they're ready for production and they've met their body weight goals. So what do I mean by all that? Well, what I mean is that we really want to focus in on the lighting program so that we can create the best possible pullet early using their own physiology, and then stimulate them at the right time when they can support production by waiting until we've met that official body weight goal. So we do that by first using our intermittent lighting program. This is a program we want to use only really for the first 7 to 10 days. You can use it after that, but I don't recommend it. But I have had people use it successfully if they have some flocks that are quite behind and might need a little bit more extra help. So for the first 7 to 10 days, I want you to use the intermittent lighting program. And then after that, you'll return to what I consider the more regular lighting program that's available in the management guide. So the advantages of this early intermittent program where the lights come on and go off is that chicks are going to have a normal pattern of rest and activity. It's going to teach them to synchronize their behavior. So lights come on, everybody gets up, they go and they get feed and water, the lights go off, and everybody goes back to sleep. That activity early on is going to cause the weak chicks that maybe wouldn't have gotten up under 24 hours of light, they might have just stayed in the same spot. When all of their friends get up around them at the same time, it's going to push them to get up and go get feed and water as well. So that's going to reduce the mortality in the weaker chicks that may have just laid in one spot and ended up dying of starvation. So it should also help you reduce your early mortality during the brooding phase. So what does the intermittent lighting program look like? Well, this is what it looks like for a closed house. So you have the 24 hours of the day here with midnight up here at the top, and then 12 noon here in the afternoon. So you can see we just have periods of darkness for 2 hours, followed by 4 hours of light where the lights are on, and that's marked by these 4 bars here, and then another 2 hours off, and then followed by 4 hours on, 2 hours off, 4 hours on, just like that for the full 24 hours. And then you run this program for the first, like I said, 7 to 10 days. So after that first week of time, it's time to step down in the program. So I'll show you what our lighting program looks like in a moment, but a lot of people get a little bit nervous because you jump from having this early light that's on, off with many hours to having 6 complete hours of darkness at once. And people get afraid that maybe the birds aren't going to eat or drink. But what we found is that sleep is really, really essential to these baby birds. They need that time to really build up their immune system and to create a normal feeding behavior. We've also learned in studies that when you have a designated nighttime that occurs, the birds are going to go and eat a whole lot and fill up their crop, and they'll actually spend more time digesting that feed over the 6 hours while they sleep. So it's actually quite good for the bird's intestinal tract, and it teaches them to really have a full fill that's going to be important later in life when they're making eggs. So this is what our lighting program looks like for highline. You can see for closed houses in the beginning, this off, on period of time. These are the number of hours of the day, right? This is midnight and this is noon. And so in the beginning, intermittent for the first 7 days. When they're 7 days old, so week 1, they should be about 72 grams of age. Your weight is down here. And this is the number of hours of light they see. So the first thing they do is they get 18 hours of light, which then out of 24 gives you 6 hours of darkness. At week 2, you're going to drop down to 17 hours. Week 3, you're going to drop down to 16 hours. So each week drops down 1, and you do a really nice gradual shift until you get down to 9 weeks of age when you hit 10 hours of darkness. So every night the bird should sleep for 10 hours. And then you want to hold that 10 hours of darkness really until you reach this body weight here at 15 weeks, which is about 1.3 kilograms to 1.5 kilograms is usually my recommendation for when you can light stimulate. So you don't ever want to stimulate before 1.35, but when they reach 1.35, it's okay. If your birds are very, very heavy and you're at 1.35 here in the 14-week range, I still would like you to wait to stimulate until you get to 15 weeks. But it is okay if you did your first 2-hour increase here. So that being said, once you reach 1,350 grams, then you can increase the light hours they see by 2. So with the Highland Brown, we found by looking at birds all over the world that they seem to have a better stimulation by having a large increase earlier. So rather than stepping up slowly, like you may have done in the past, this bird responds really well to having a 2-hour increase at first, and then just stepping up 1 hour at a time until you reach 16 hours of light in production. And then you'll hold 16 hours for the rest of the life of the bird. So how do we know if we're doing a good job with our feed, with our light, with our air? Well, it actually is pretty simple. We do this regularly, just weigh the birds. Weigh the birds and check your uniformities. And that's going to give you an idea is if the feed that you're giving them is giving them the right energy allocation. If they're on par with that standard and what your expectations are, you know that they're using energy in the right way and not having to push a lot of it to stress. So why are these weekly weights and uniformity so important? Well, I can identify and correct problems much earlier. If a producer is taking body weights at week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, and the birds get behind at week 2, I can catch them up much faster than if the first body weight they ever took was week 5 and they're now 200 grams behind. That's really, really difficult to make up. So taking body weights every single week allows you to make adjustments much faster than you would otherwise and potentially save a flock and have better production. The other major benefit to doing regular weekly body weights in all of your flocks is because maybe you have the same problem every time. And if you see every single time my birds get behind at week 3, every time without fail, they always were behind the standard before that, then you know I probably have an issue that's occurring between my week 2 weigh and my week 3 weigh. So what's going on? Maybe reevaluate any vaccinations happening at that time. Maybe you have a bronchitis virus issue that's coming in at that age. Maybe there's something else going on in terms of mycoplasmas or other diseases. And so it's a really, really good way for you to understand individual problems for your farms that can show up just in the weight, and you can design a better prevention and perception program for that. So weekly body weights, what should they look like? There's some really easy cheats to have in mind. Body weight at week 1 should be about double your chick weight. So in the first 7 days, you really want them to double their mass. So if they arrive at 30 grams, I want to make sure they're at least 60 grams by 7 days of age. 35 grams should be 70 grams, very simple. By 5 weeks of age, they should be at least 10 times the chick weight. So if they arrive at 30 grams, I should have a 300-gram chick at 5 weeks. Then lastly, the body weight gain here at 12 weeks, you want to have the maximum growth to be done. So between 6 and 12 weeks of age is when the bird really packs on the most muscle and skeleton, and you're going to see a much more dramatic increase in weight. And that's the time, this growing time, this frame building size, that's really, really critical. Because after 12 weeks, she's not building frame anymore. She's building fat. And so trying to catch a bird up that's way behind standard and is 13 weeks old, you're just going to build a very, very fat bird, and we need to be careful in how we do that. So our big goal is maximizing this weight gain between 6 and 12 weeks. So if we're behind at 6 weeks, we want to make sure we really pump up whatever she needs nutritionally or decrease whatever stressors are going on to encourage that weight gain. And then lastly, at body weight at 18 weeks of age, we really would like to see a bird that's at least 1.5 kilograms, potentially a little bit more going into the production phase so that she has plenty of nutrients and support going forward. So good body weight uniformity. What's important to understand is that uniformity is a reflection of both the really, really good birds and the really weak ones. And our goal is to have those birds in a very, very narrow gap so that most of the birds are pretty similar. And so you want to have 10% of the mean on either side out here, and then you want the rest of the 80% of the birds to be pretty darn uniform to the mean. Bad body weight uniformities are going to be anything outside of these parameters here. So you want to have at least 80 to 85% uniformity. I really shoot for 85% and above in my growing birds. And then when I have laying hens, I want my body weights to be within at least 70 to 80% uniformity. Bad body weight uniformity is going to be usually only 60% of the birds are within 10% of the mean, and then everybody else is on either side. And what that means is I have some birds that might be really, really huge out here on the end, and then I might have some birds that are teeny, teeny, tiny. And these giant birds out here are at risk of maybe having mortality post-peak because of fatty liver disease. It's going to occur. And then these smaller, weak birds that are down on this end, they're so small they may not have good egg production, and they're going to pull your peak down, and your pen day is not going to look as good, and they're probably not going to provide you with as many eggs over the life of the bird. So it's important to pull as many as possible into this nice even phase here in the middle where you have good uniformity. What happens if they aren't eating well, right? This is all well and good, great if they can gain weight, but what if my birds are not eating enough? Well, there's a couple of things we can do to really help support that. We can use our lighting program to help us. So midnight feeding is super, super beneficial, and we can add almost 2 to 5 grams of intake per day just by instituting this program. So you can start as soon as you have at least 7 hours of darkness. And that gives you the space you need to go ahead and add in an hour of midnight feeding to start. So what this looks like is you actually have your normal daylight length, and that can be 16 hours or 17 hours of daylight. And then you want to start with either a 4-hour or 3-hour dark period. I prefer the 4-hour dark period, but 3 is okay, and I will show you a slide with that. And then you add in either 1 or 2 hours. Usually when you start, I start with 1 hour. So I have my full, let's say, 17 hours of daylight. Then I have my darkness period. Then I have 1 hour of light that allows them to get up and eat during the coolest parts of the night. And then I go back to another 2 hours of sleep and then back to daylight. What this does is stimulate this nighttime snacking and feed intake by allowing feeding during cooler times of the day. So people ask me, when should I put it in? Should I do it in the beginning of the night? Should I do it at the end of the night? And the goal is really, by allowing the birds to eat when it's cold outside, they're going to have a better intake. So pick the coolest part of your program, and that's where you want to institute this midnight feeding. So this is what it looks like if you're only going to have 3 hours of darkness, and you'll see this in our management guide. So you can have a full 16 hours during the day, 3 hours of darkness here. Add in your first hour 1 week, and then later you can come back in the next week and add a second hour in to improve feed intake even more, and then another 3 hours of darkness before your day begins again. So what does it really mean when the growth rate or uniformity is affected? So you've done everything, but we're still not there on our growth rates or uniformity. Or perhaps you're not really sure why a flock is off, but they're behind on the standard, or my uniformity is very, very poor. Well, it means that we have a lot of stress going on, because if we remember what our resources look like, stress is going to push these arrows in a direction. Anytime the bird becomes stressed, this arrow is going to get smaller, and these other arrows are going to change. So it's important to remember stress changes our energy resources, and that's why our body weights are behind, because the birds did not give enough energy to that growth process as we expected them to. So what kinds of things cause stress in the birds that might not be as obvious as disease? Well, just having slow feeder speeds can cause a lot of stress in the birds, because they have to compete to get to food, or they have to wait for a long time, and it's very stressful. Not having enough feedings during the day can do the same thing. It can be very, very stressful to have competition. Not having enough feeder space, they just can't get to it and can't fight past the bigger birds. Not having enough drinking water or water access is the same thing. Birds are going to drink almost twice what they eat, and so having a decrease in water intake is going to inadvertently decrease your feed intake. Having crowding, again, this competition for space, this feeling like they can't lay down where they want to be comfortable and they have to jostle around a lot, can make birds very stressed. Having a poor beak trimming can be stressful either because it's painful, because the beak can't appropriately contact with your nipple or your cup drinker for water intake or for feed intake, and that can cause you a lot of problems. Feed refusal obviously is very stressful. If you have poor quality feeds or a high mycotoxin content in your feeds, then you're not going to have enough intake and it's going to decrease your total resources, but also be stressful for the birds because they're still hungry. Enteric diseases like coccidiosis are awful at stealing energy away from the birds. Gumboro disease is very difficult on the immune system. It really destroys the bursa and causes immunosuppression, which means now the birds have to spend even more energy fighting off bacteria and viruses because their immune system wasn't built appropriately. And then even simple things like abrupt feed formulation changes. Birds don't like surprises. They don't like to have a lot change in the house very quickly. So managing those stressors are going to be very, very beneficial in the long run for decreasing problems with weight and uniformity. So what are our goals at the end of the day to build this nice layer is we want to have just really good management from the start. If you do things right from the start, it's going to get you a lot further by the end of the day. Make everything super easy for the bird to find. Like I said, if you build it, they will come. All you have to do is make it easy for them to find feed and water. That bird is going to do the rest. It's going to eat, it's going to drink, and it's going to be happy to be there and grow its body systems. Always, always, always monitor what your progress is to ensure what you're doing is working. If you're not meeting the body weight standard, if you're not meeting the expectations you have for your farm, then something is going wrong. So reevaluate your program and remember to inspect what you expect to have happen. And then lastly, as I'm sure you'll talk about with the veterinarian in Korea, is you want to make sure that you can control disease with location-specific vaccination programs and really good biosecurity practices. So what I mean by that is there are different diseases in different parts of the world, and you have to select what's important for your farm. So just because something works in the United States does not mean it's going to work in Korea. And you need to pick what works for you and your birds. And then, of course, biosecurity is so, so important. That's that sanitation piece. If you keep the disease out, your birds can't get sick. And so biosecurity is critical for maintaining that. All right. So if you ever want more information or you want to understand different diseases that might contact your birds, you want to understand different feeding options, things like that, we have a tremendous number of technical resources on the website, which you can find here at www.highline.com, and there's a lot of technical bulletins there. And then if you have any other questions, you can, of course, ask the lovely people who distribute the Highline bird at KPTS, or, of course, any of us here at Highline. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope you feel like you understand how to raise the best layer that you can.